Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. After humoral immunity, we will discuss the other aspect of the immunity, that is the cell-mediated immunity. When we talk about the cell-mediated immunity, its constituents, as the name implies, the cell-mediated, its constituents they include various cells. For example, there is the participation of the T cells, which include helper T cells, cytotoxic T cells. There is the presence of macrophages. Then comes the role of the natural killer cells. So these are the various types of the cells that are involved in the cell mediated immunity. What these cells do, how they perform their function, we have discussed in detail in the previous lecture. So this cell mediated immunity, it is just a brief overview of all the cells which we have studied previously, how they perform their functions. So when we have to describe the cell mediated immunity, we have to study the constituent cells which are involved in the cell mediated immunity, and the constituent cells that take part, that play a role in the cell mediated immunity. The most important one being the lymphocytes, the T lymphocytes, um, the B lymphocytes. B lymphocytes ultimately they will lead to the formation of immunoglobulin. So T lymphocytes are the most important one. Then comes the role of the macrophages, which are also called as the phagocytes, which perform the function of phagocytosis. Similarly, we have the cytotoxic T cells. The T lymphocyte, they are divided into two types, the helper T cells and the cytotoxic T cells. So cytotoxic T cells, they perform a very important function. Then comes the natural killer cells, which kill the virus infected cells, which play a role in killing the tumor cells. So all the previous things, and then the test for the evaluation, how we will evaluate the cell mediated immunity. So we'll discuss these tests. They, although they are not that much common, but we will discuss and we will have a brief overview of these tests which are helpful in the evaluation of this cell mediated immunity. So basically, whenever you have to write something about the cell-mediated immunity, when we have to discuss some points, important points about the cell-mediated immunity, just remember this picture. Keep this picture in mind, and then you people will be able to explain the cell-mediated immunity and the immune responses associated with the various types of the cells. So as I previously pointed out, the various types of the cells that are involved in the cell-mediated immunity, they are the macrophages, the T cells, which include the helper T cells, the memory T cells, the natural killer cells, and the cytotoxic T cells. So memory T cells is very important. It gives the memory to the immune response, our immune system, our immune cells. They remember the antigen which has previously infected our body. So the role of these memory cells, that is very important. When we discuss the cell-mediated immunity, just a brief overview about the function of the various cells. As you all know, the helper T cells. The helper T cells, they mainly participate. The main role of these helper T cells is the recognition of the antigen, and they recognize the antigen when the antigen is presented to them, and that antigen is presented in association with the class 2 histocompatibility complex, and the macrophages are the main cells which presents the antigen to the T cells. Similarly, if we talk about the cytotoxic T cells, they have very important function of killing the virus infected cells. They also participate, they also have a role in the graft rejection. They also have a role in killing the tumor cells. When we talk about the natural killer cells, again they kill the virus infected cells, and these natural killer cells, they also kill the, or they also inactivate the pathogenesis. If we talk about various bacterial infection, for example, very common bacterial infection, that is a Mycobacterium tuberculosis, very common in our society. There is the response of cell mediated immunity, delayed type of hypersensitivity reaction, that is mainly involved in this reaction of the mycobacteria against the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. We perform a skin test that is called as PPD skin test, in which we inject subcutaneously purified protein derivative, and it causes a local reaction which involves the macrophages and the helper T cells, and we note the induration of the reaction that is present at that local area. Similarly, if we talk about the viruses, especially the common viruses, if we talk about the common viruses, like measles is a very common virus in our societies. There was a huge outbreak of the measles few years ago, about 5 to 6 years ago in 2014 and 15. And similarly, varicella zoster virus and some other viruses like cytomegalovirus, cell-mediated immunity is also initiated against these viruses. Uh, there are uh, uh, there are few cytokines that are also involved in this cell mediated immunity. These cells, these macrophages, killer cells, helper T cells, and cytotoxic T cells, they perform their function with the help of these cytokines. And there was a complete lecture about the various cytokines, their roles, their function previously. So as I already pointed out, that this cell mediated immunity, it is basically an overview of all the cells which we have studied till now. Along with the cells, there is a role of the cytokines, various cytokines. You people also have studied these cytokines previously. Moving on to the previous slide again, the tests for the evaluation of the cell mediated immunity. So there are two statements that are written: in vivo test and in vitro test. When we talk about the living organism, how we evaluate the cell mediated immunity in some living person, in human being. So a very common example which I just told you is the purified protein derivative reaction. Purified protein derivative which is injected subcutaneously. Again, the cell mediated immunity is noted, the induration is noted, the inflammation is noted, and this test is helpful in the diagnosis of the tuberculosis. Similarly, if we talk about the in vitro test, so they are not that much commonly used in our hospitals and routine practice, but however they need to be elaborated here. One very important thing is the macrophage migration inhibitory factor. We measure the level of this macrophage migration inhibitory factor, and remember this migration inhibitory factor, macrophage migration inhibitory factor, that is elaborated by T cells when they are exposed to the antigen. So we measure the level of this migration inhibitory factor in the blood. Similarly, a very uncommon test not in routine practice, especially in Pakistan, that is the lymphocyte blast transformation. When the lymphocytes, when they are exposed to antigen, the immune system, it increases the synthesis of the DNA, and numerous T lymphocytes are formed in the numerous immature lymphocytes are formed, which are called as the blast cells. So we measure the rate of transformation of these blast cells into the mature lymphocytes. So these are not that much common tests. Yes, the skin test that is done for purified protein derivative, that is done for the tuberculosis, that is in routine practice in our society. And especially when we talk about the children, the pediatricians, they order that test, and it is helpful in the diagnosis of the tuberculosis. So cell mediated immunity, again the same things which you have studied previously. If a note comes in the SCQ, write a small note, write a brief note on the cell mediated immunity and the various cells that participate in the cell mediated immunity. So you can write about the various cells, the factors which they elaborate, how they perform their function, how they causes the inactivation of the various cells, which type of the cells which are destroyed by these macrophages, lymphocytes, and natural killer cells. So a brief overview of all the previous type of the cells. So this was a very brief lecture about the cell mediated immunity. In the next lecture we'll discuss one of the very important topic. We'll discuss the complement system. Complement system is very important, especially from the SCQ point of view. So inshallah ta'ala, in the next lecture we'll start off with the complement system. Till then, Allah Hafiz.